Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome you here to Little Rock Baptist Church tonight. We thank you all for coming. We want to say thank you so much to Little Rock Baptist Church for allowing us to conduct this here. We appreciate the use of your wonderful facility. At this time, I'd like to present this lady. I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Deborah Stanfield, I'm president of the Houston County Historical Society, the co-sponsor of this event.
And I am Paul Bailey, the president of the Houston County Chamber of Commerce, and we are so fortunate to have our special guest speaker. And I want to say thank you so much. I would also like to remind you that after this event is over, we will have cookies and punch, and we'd like for you to come back and fellowship and enjoy each other's company. And I, at this time, am going to ask Ms. Tanya Blades to introduce our special guest speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm not going to use the microphone because I can talk loud. So I want to thank you all for coming. I'm so excited. There's such a crowd. Me and Angie were thinking about what to do for speakers, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to have John Baker about the Washington book. And I'm so excited you've come to let him share with you his story. And I want you to think about, just like Mayor Paul has talked to us about Deborah being a co-sponsor, is the way to do these things is to partner with people in your community. And I want to say exactly as they partnered, I want you to partner with each other so we can tell a full history of everyone in our community about City of Aaron, Tennessee Ridge, and Houston County, because I think there's so much here. As I have always come to Houston County and City of Aaron and Tennessee Ridge and always enjoyed myself, I saw all this food back there, and you guys always throw a good gathering, and many people show up. So I'm so excited, and I'm always pleasantly surprised when I come to your community. So thank you, and I want to introduce Mr. John Baker. I've known him, I've been at my job for 20 years in Nashville, but I've been going into different communities, and one of them being Robertson County as well as Houston County, and doing history. So I've met him many years ago, probably before I actually heard about his book and heard about what his story was. But I probably saw him at the archive. So I want to let you know that the archive is an interesting place to meet a variety of people if you're researching your community's history or your family history. But I'm so excited for having John, that he would come out here and share this with you, and I won't delay any longer, and I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you all so much for inviting me. I'll be speaking about the Washingtons of Wessington Plantation. The search for my family's history started by accident when I was in the 7th grade, and I was flipping through a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee. And I came to this photograph, and for some reason it caught my attention, and each time I would go to class, I would look at this photograph thinking perhaps I should know the individuals, but I had no clue who I was actually looking at. So after we got out of school for summer vacation, it was the plantation where this photograph was taken, 160th anniversary. And so they did a feature about the plantation in the Robertson County Times in Springfield. And they had this picture. This time they had their names listed. Seated was Emmanuel Washington, the cook. Seated beside him was his wife, Henny Washington, who was the head laundress there. Standing was Allen Washington, who was the head dairyman. And standing right was Granville Washington, who was the valet of George A. Washington, who was the owner of the plantation. And this was taken in 1891. So my maternal grandmother, Sally Washington Nicholson, was visiting us from Chicago. And she spent the weekend with one of her older brothers, and she called my mom up and she said, have John to bring the camera when y'all come to pick me up. And I said, Mama, why does Big Mama want me to bring the camera out to Uncle Bob? And my mother said, boy, get the camera and do like she said. You'll find out when you get there. So when I got there, my grandmother showed me the newspaper article. And I said, Big Mama, that picture is in our history book. Who is that? And so she pointed and she said, that was my grandfather, and he was the cook on the Washington farm, which the official name of the plantation is Wessington, but everyone refers to it as the Washington farm. And she said, that's my grandmother. So I couldn't wait to get back to school to tell my classmates that my great-great-grandparents' picture was in our social studies textbook. And my grandmother was excited to see the photograph as well because they passed away before she was born and she was the baby of the family. But her brother knew them personally. So he said, well, call out to the Washington house and tell them who you are. Some of the Washingtons still live out there. And he said the main house is still there, some of the slave cabins, and a cemetery where our family's buried. So the very next morning, I called out there and I spoke to Ann Consolidum Talley. And she was a sixth-generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded the plantation in 1796. And I told her that I'd seen the newspaper article and I was interested in my family's history. And I told her who my great-great-grandparents were. And she said, well, everyone knows who your great-great-grandfather was. We still have his portrait in the living room. So this is the portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington. And the Washingtons commissioned the famous artist Maria Howard Wheaton, who specialized in painting African Americans during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Emmanuel was born in Wessington in 1824, and he died there in 1907 and is buried in the slave cemetery there. She ran a bookstore in Springfield called The Bookstore, and so it was within walking distance of my house, so I went there. And so she brought out about 10 or 11 legal-sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. So I was able to find my great-great-grandfather, Manuel, born April 23rd, 1824. I was able to find my great-great-grandmother's age and some of our early ancestors as well. This is the Washington family crest. And the Washington's first ancestor was William D. Hertburn, who lived in the 12th century. And for military service, one of the kings of England gave them an estate called Wessington. So the Washingtons became known as the Wessington, and when they came to America, they changed that to Washington in 1656. So Joseph Washington named the estate after their earliest ancestors. This is the entrance gate to Wessington. And when I was a small child, my grandfather would take, my mother's father, Joe Cobbs, would take me for a ride out in the country just about every Sunday. And often we would come up to Wessington's entrance gate, and my grandfather would stop or slow down and point and say, that's Washington, that's where your grandmother's family came from. Which at that age, 5 or 6, I knew my grandmother was a Washington, but that's as far as it went. So Ann invited me to come out to Wessington. And so my mother had to drive me, and so as soon as I got to the entrance gate, it dawned on me all the years that had passed, what my grandfather was really telling me, that my ancestry there went back some 200 years. This is the Wessington Mansion, and it was started in 1815 and completed in 1819, built entirely by the slaves, so this year is its 200th anniversary. My first trip there was like stepping back in time. The mansion was furnished with furniture from the 1800s, Civil War period, and some even earlier that Mr. Washington brought from Virginia when he came to Tennessee. There were portraits of some of the other slaves. This rocking chair has been passed down to some of the slave descendants, and there were other furnishings that had been passed down to them as well. When I first went to Wessington, there was probably about 10 log cabins still standing. And in 1860, there were 40 cabins which housed 274 enslaved individuals, which that year was the largest in the state of Tennessee. Ms. Tapp also took me to the slave cemetery at Wessington and told me that my great-great-grandmother and father were both buried there, as well as some of our earlier ancestors. Ms. Tapp also told me that the Washingtons deposited all their records from the plantation in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in 1964. This is now on 69 rolls of microfilm. It's over 11,000 documents, and I've gone through all this many times, tracing not only my ancestry, but all the families that came from Wessington. There are many letters in this collection. Joseph Washington and Mary Washington's son was George A. Washington. And so by his father being older, he pretty much ran the plantation. So he would go to New Orleans when they sold their tobacco crops. He would go to Virginia and Maryland to purchase slaves, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was away, his wife, his mother, his father, and the plantation overseer would write letters, what's going on the plantation, who ran away, who had a baby, the Native Americans coming up to the big house to get food and water before they were marched out on the Trail of Tears. Excuse me one second. And there's so much detail on some of the slaves, you feel like you know them personally. And also, by knowing some of their descendants, you see some family traits that have been passed on. There are many photographs of some of the former slaves in this collection and plantation records. This is a document where, after emancipation, my great-great-grandfather agreed to work for the Washington family for $125 a year as the cook, and he was to get every other Sunday off. This is his recipe for cornbread, and my mother made that for me. It's very good. Excuse me for some technical difficulties. This gentleman was Joseph Washington, and he was born in Southampton County, Virginia, July 8, 1770. Standing beside him was his wife. So Mr. Washington came to Tennessee with one of his uncles and about 25 other people from Southampton County, Virginia. He was engaged to one of his first cousins, Roseanne Branch. On the way to Tennessee, they encountered another party that was coming in the same, going in the same direction. And so she pretty much dumped Joseph for a guy from this other group. So Joseph came on to Robeson County, Tennessee, and he went to the home of his cousin, Colonel Arthur Cheatham. And so when he went to the Cheatham home, this lady was a baby small enough to be carried in the arms. So someone asked him, he being a bachelor, when he was going to get married, and he said, well, I'll wait till she grows up and I'll marry her, which is what he did in 1812 when she was 16 and he was 42. Which her dad was the wealthiest man in our county as well, so that probably helped. This is the route that Mr. Washington would have taken. He and the slaves from Southampton County, Virginia, to Robeson County, Tennessee. This would have taken about 2.5 to 3 months, and some of the slaves passed on to their direct descendants if they walked every step of the way. This is George A. Washington, who was born in Wessington in 1815, and he died there in 1892. This is his second wife, Jane Smith Washington, and she was born in 1830 in Florence, Alabama, and died in Nashville at the home of one of her daughters in 1894. The Tennessee State Museum contacted me in 2012 and wanted to do an exhibit based on my book, and it was called Slaves and Slaveholders of Wessington Plantation, and this is a model of Wessington, how it would have looked in 1860. This shows the main house, some of the slave quarters, the cooper shop, blacksmith shops, and other outbuildings. And during the exhibit, we had about 70,000 visitors that toured it, and NPT did a documentary based on my book and the exhibit. And it's going to be shown on February 25th on Channel 8 at 11:30 p.m. And it's been shown around the country as well. Slave population and source of slaves in Wessington. In 1795, when Mr. Washington was still in Virginia, he owned 5 slaves that were classified as being taxable, which were individuals that were 12 to 15 years old. In 1813, when he was in Robeson County, he owned 33. By 1820, he owned 44, being second only to his father-in-law, Arthur Cheatham, who owned 77 at that time. In 1830, he owned 80, 1840, 109, 1850, 143, 1860, 274 slaves, which made them the largest slaveholders in the state of Tennessee. Mr. Washington received 16 slaves by inheritance from his brother, his father, and his other relatives in Virginia, and his father-in-law. He and his son purchased 125 slaves from 1801 to 1843, and there were approximately 195 born from 1795 to 1860. And in all that I've been able to document, there's about 455 individuals that were enslaved on Wessington from 1795 to 1865. The document on the right is a slave bill of sale from my great-great-great-grandmother, who was the mother of Emmanuel the cook. She was owned by Colonel Michael Blow on a plantation in Sussex County, Virginia. He owned a pretty good-sized plantation of about 50 slaves. He was a Revolutionary War soldier. He passed away in 1799, and 15 of his slaves went to his son, Micaiah Blow, which included my family. And so in a couple of years, Micaiah became heavily indebted And he sold my great-great-great-grandmother at age 10 and her sister Sarah at age 12 to Joseph Washington, and he brought them to Robertson County, Tennessee. And they likely never saw any of their family members from Virginia again. And so since that time, there's been 11 generations of our family that's lived in Robertson County. This is a document that I compiled from slave bills of sale from the Washington collection from 1841 through 1843. It lists the names of the individual, the age at the time that they were purchased if known, the date of the purchase, the state and county, the type of purchase, if it was a single purchase, a mother and children, or an entire family, the amount that they were purchased for, and who the previous owner was. And I'm planning on doing a book with all the genealogical information that I've collected over the years, so anyone in the future will be able to link their ancestry back to the earliest beginnings at West. This is some more of them. And these are 3 examples of bills of sale. This bill of sale is for my great-great-great-great-grandmother and father, the grandparents of my great-great-grandmother that was shown on the picture. This is the first nuclear family or entire family that the Washingtons purchased that we can document, was my 4th great-grandfather and mother and their 4 children. And this Henny that's 11 months old was the mother of my great-great-grandmother that's on the photograph. The next situation we have is there was a gentleman that had purchased 14 slaves from the Union Bank of Tennessee in Nashville, and he was unable to pay for the slaves. So basically the bank repossessed these 14 individuals, and Mr. Washington went to Nashville and bought all of them and brought them to Weston. In the next case, there's 29 slaves where Mr. Washington's first wife was Margaret Adelaide Lewis, and her father was Major William B. Lewis, who was a close friend to President Andrew Jackson. And as a wedding gift, he gave them 29 slaves for $1, and this consisted of 7 interrelated families. And the plantation they were enslaved on was called Fairfield. And it was later turned into a convent school in Nashville. Mr. Washington also loaned Andrew Jackson Jr. $15,000, and he was a poor money manager. So he proposed to Mr. Washington, when Mr. Washington was pressing him to get his money back, that he would give him the slaves from the Hermitage as payment. So Mr. Washington told him that he had enough slaves, he didn't want the slaves, he wanted the money. And I presented this information to the Hermitage, and they said, no, that never happened. And so when we were doing the exhibit, we found a newspaper article where they were advertised to be sold to take care of that debt. Names of Westington slaves. From the birth register and slave bills of sale, I was able to trace some of the slaves to, some of them had true African names. So we can determine what tribe some of them descended from. Most slaves had biblical names. Some had classical names like Caesar or Pompey. Most individuals named their children for members of their own families, especially males, since they have a tendency to be sold away from the family more often. Then we had several that had place names: America, Axum, which is an ancient city in Ghana, and Ethiopia, Britain, Carolina. Tom, there was already 2 Toms there, so when this one came there, he was from South Carolina, so they called him Carolina Tom. There was Hampton, Israel, Jordan, Louisiana, Richmond, and Washington. Then there were some named after the presidents: Harrison, Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Washington. And some of the slaves that had close relationships with the white Washington family named their children for some of the white Washington family members. In 2003, I started the Westington DNA Project, and many of you no doubt have heard the controversy with Sally Hemings supposedly having children by Thomas Jefferson. So I said, well, we could use this technology with the Westington descendants. So I contacted a number of their descendants, and I told them, asked them, would they participate if I paid for the test? And since I was paying for it, they willingly participated. So we were able to track the African origins of many of the slave families from Westington. So when I did this, one of the descendants of Joseph Washington, told me, he said, well, John, you know, it's been passed down in our family that we were closely related to President Washington. So while you're doing this, let's do the DNA test on our family and see if that's so or not. So there was only one Washington male who descended from Joseph Washington, who founded Wessington. Then in Chapmansboro, there's a Washington who descends from George Washington, the president's uncle. So he agreed to submit his DNA. And it did prove that the Washingtons were related to President Washington. However, it was going back 800 years, much farther than they thought. And what happened was President George Washington's great-grandfather was John Washington, who came to America in 1656. And the Washingtons that founded Wessington's ancestor, John Washington, came in 1657, and they thought for years that they were the same individual, but found that they were distant cousins. So the Washingtons were terribly disappointed to find that information out. So they can't prove or disprove family lore. Families and housing in Wessington. The slaves were housed in single-family units. They had log flooring, glass windows with shutters, brick-in chimneys, a loft for the children. Most of the cabins measured 20 by 20 or 20 by 36, depending on how large the families were. There were 40 structures in 1860 that housed 274 individuals. 22 of the households were headed, of 27 were headed by men, which this was extremely rare for the antebellum period, as men had a tendency to be sold away from families more. Some families had 3 to 5 generations, which that was extremely rare as well. And these are some of the slave cabins at Wessington, the two on the left. It was taken with a one-step camera, so some of you that remember those know how far long ago that was, in the 70s. So this was one of the cabins, and this is the side of another one. This photograph was taken, I think, in the 1890s, and this was taken in 1895. And this is another shot of an inside of a slave cabin, and this was done for the exhibit, Slaves and Slaveholders, at the Tennessee State Museum. Labor division on the plantation. The men worked under a task system, which meant the owner assigned a certain task, and once that was completed, they could work on their own crops. Of course, they knew how much work an average man could do in a day, so they set the task where it was going to take up your entire day. So, however, they were only required to work half a day on Saturday and none on Sunday. So during this time, they could work on their own crops. Tobacco was the main production on the plantation, other crops as well. There were blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, and all the surplus corn that did not go into feeding the slave population in the Washington family and the livestock went into producing whiskey. They also processed huge amounts of pork each year, and the Washingtons were known and famous for Washington hams, and they could be found on menus of the most exquisite restaurants as far south as New Orleans and as far north as Philadelphia. The women on the plantation primarily cultivated gardens. They did sowing and weeding for the community. They did domestic work, processing pork, milking cows, caring for the children, and caring for the elderly and sick, and doing cooking for their own families. There was also a building on the plantation where women who had children that were 2 or 3 years old, older women that were too old to work, cared for them while their mothers worked. This is a photograph of a group of African American and white sharecroppers at Wessington. This was taken in 1907. This is a lady preparing to do the wash. And this is a hog killer on the plantation. And this is a group of former slaves processing the pork. And then that's a smokehouse in the background. And that building is still standing at Wessington today. This is a tobacco field on Wessington. And in 1860, the slaves produced 250,000 pounds of dark fire tobacco, making them the largest producers in the United States and the second largest in the world. And this would have taken about 350 acres, so the groves would have been literally as far as the eye could see or further. And this was used in the exhibit to show how some of the slave clothing was manufactured on the plantation. This is the smokehouse at Wessington, and each week on Saturdays, the women would line up at the smokehouse and they'd be given so many pounds of bacon, meal, flour, sugar, vegetables, and poultry, depending on the number of individuals in their household. And they also hunted wild game by trapping and shooting them. Marriages between slaves were not recognized legally, but some of them did marry. And the earliest documentation I could find was the bill of sale in 1814 of Tom and Jenny, who were my fourth great-great-grandparents, indicating that they were married. In another instance, Mr. Washington noted in his diary in 1851 that Tom asked Olive to be his wife. And then in a pension application, one of my great-great-grandfather's sisters, Clara, applied to get her husband's pension, and she stated that she had been married by an African-American minister in the 1840s, and she was married by a member of the Freedmen's Bureau after emancipation. Rebellion and punishment on the plantation. One form of rebellion was running away, aiding others in running away, leaving without permission, fighting overseers. We have many cases where some of the slaves attacked the overseers, refusing to work, breaking tools, riding draft animals so they would be too tired to work the next day, work slowdowns, and of course they had disagreements among themselves, so some of them got into fights, also pretended to be sick. If you were sick, you had to let it be known, and the mistress of the plantation would come by and determine if you were sick enough not to go to work. If you were sick, they'd send for a doctor. And we have a lot of doctor bills for the Washingtons from 1815 to 1860, and it's also a good source of genealogical information as well. How this was dealt with: they could be whipped, confined, not allowing others to visit all the plantation door, allowing others to go from the plantation and ultimately sell. And there's only 2 cases of any individuals being sold from the plantation, and that was in the 1850s. This is a list, and it's in my book called Wessington Rebels, and these are individuals who ran away from the plantation, who fought the overseers or assisted others in running away. The first instance that I have been able to document was a slave named Jack. He was 18 when he ran away in September of 1838. He was out maybe a week and a half. He was captured in Cadiz, Kentucky, and a $30 reward was offered for his return. Another slave, Lewis, was hired to an ironworks. He met another gentleman there that was a blacksmith, and their plans were to run away, to go to Canada. The blacksmith was going to teach him his trade, and they were to go into business with one another. So the overseer wanted to find out what prompted Lewis to run away. Freedom wouldn't be enough. And so he promised him that he wouldn't punish him if he told him why, because he wanted to make sure that other slaves were not planning on rebelling or running away. And after he told him that he had planned to go to Canada, he was punished. $40 reward was offered for his capture. Another slave, Davy, ran away when he was 30 in September of 1854. He was out until October 7, 1854, and he was in Evansville, Indiana, and he had nearly reached, freaked out of the grasp of the overseers, but he had an axe and he tried to kill a sheriff that was trying to take him back to the plantation. So he ran away 3 other times, and Washington decided to sell him, and they sold him in the New Orleans slave market. And after emancipation, he came back to Wessington, where he had 3 brothers that were still living. They then went to Cheatham County as sharecroppers, and then some of their descendants moved to Nashville, and I've met some of their descendants. This is Jane Smith, Washington, and her great-uncle James Jackson owned a plantation called the Forks of Cypress. And many of you may remember years ago the miniseries that Halle Berry played in called Queen. It was based on Queen's experience at the Forks of Cypress plantation. Jane Smith's father died when she was a child, and she was very wealthy. And her mother wanted to free the slaves, but it was against Alabama law. So this abolitionist minister said, well, if you will marry me, I will free your slaves. So she married him, and so after she married him, he refused to free them. And she even left money and stipulations in her will to emancipate them and send them to Liberia. And he challenged the will in court and won. So they never got their freedom. Later on, however, I did find a letter in the Washington family papers where a slave, Elijah Smith, had ran away, and he had made it to Canada. And he wrote Jane's aunt, who lived in Nashville, basically stating he didn't know who his mistress may have married, but if she would send his freedom papers to Detroit, he would send whatever she thought he was worth if it was reasonable. And he said, tell her that half a loaf is better than no loaf at all. So basically not to get too greedy. I don't know if she ever took him up on this or not, The only reason that I could think that he would even entertain the idea of purchasing his freedom when he's in Canada is he must have had relatives still enslaved in the United States and possibly wanted to free them as well. Surgeon, welcome. And sometimes she would call me on my cell phone because she had broken her ankle and it didn't heal up, and she had a lot of problems with that. And so sometimes when I bring groups, and she said, well, John, I feel pretty good today. You can bring them in the house. And so I'd break them up in like 15 at a time or something. And in July, another African-American family whose ancestors came from there, it was about 100 of them that came from Atlanta, so I gave them a tour of the grounds. And I tried not to intrude as far as trying to go in the house. But years ago, I would take people in the house. But I generally give them a history of the plantation at the main house, then I take them to the slave cemetery, and then a restored cabin. Yes?
How big is the plantation?
At its peak, it was 13,100 acres in one continuous farm, and now it's 2,735 acres. Anyone else? Yes?
You said you had a history of Verizon?
Yes, I worked there 20 years.
How do we stop robocalls?
I left there in 2007.
Workshop.
It was a good place to work. Anyone else? Yes.
How long did it take you to compose all of this?
After it's still a work in progress. It's not a week that goes by, I don't get an email from somebody. But I worked on it about 2 years, a year and a half to 2 years, getting all this stuff together. Most people have a problem where they don't have enough stuff, and they got to sort of make up stuff to fill in. And I had way, way too much stuff because my editor said, she said, John, for the first time in my life, she said, I feel like I've bitten off more than I can chew with you. She said, you've got enough information for 10 books. And I've done research on some celebrities. Lionel Richie, I traced Lionel Richie's roots for Who Do You Think You Are. I got to meet him, and I forgot, like Ben, this the football player, I did some research on him and several others. And Method Man, the rapper, I don't know if you would know him. He's a cousin of mine, and I've done research on him. I sent his mother a family tree that's a little larger than this one, and so she told me last week she's having it framed. So it goes on and on and on. And like even the white Washingtons, if they want to know how they're related to somebody else, they say, hey John, exactly, break it down to be how I'm related to so-and-so. And most of the time I do it off the top of my head. Method Man is on a series called Drop the Mic. I think it aired 2 weeks ago.
When did you think this would be on?
It will be on February 25th on NPT Channel 8 at 11:30 p.m. And it basically tells the story. It starts with my great-great-grandfather's mother when she and her sister at 10 and 12 are walking from Virginia when they've been sold away from their family. And then it highlights different things throughout the years at West. Anyone else? Yes.
I have heard you speak before, and I think I remember one of the young girls that was bought from Alabama or Georgia, that maybe you told that she had to walk all the way to Springfield.
No, that was my great-great-grandfather here. His mother at 10 and her sister at 12 walked from Virginia to Tennessee.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. If anyone wants
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say thank you on behalf of the Historical Society, the Chamber of Commerce. I want to say thank you, Mr. Baker, and I would like to say thank you to Little Rock Baptist Church for allowing us to host it here. And I would like to remind you, we have cookies and punch in the room over there. Can't even think, but thank you so much.